So we're talking about language.
Yes, this came out of a free-flowing conversation that I loved for its focusing nature. It was so wide open and yet very present to what exactly was coming up in both of us creatively. And it's taken me some time since our last conversation to crystallize and clarify what was being activated in me, which is itself a focusing kind of process that I really appreciate. And I realized that I actually have very strong feelings about an aspect of this that I had been tempering for sort of going along to get along, not with you, but in the world. And it has to do with it has to do with the use of language. It has to do with the whole sort of postmodern deconstruction of language and truth, and the idea that there is no it's all perception and there is no truth, and this table is not a table. And how far our culture is willing to go with that, especially in the current socio-political scene of alternative facts and whether or not truth matters and all that. And in the middle of this pond, I want to plop the pebble of something that Gendlin has proposed and that I think is actually very valuable, the idea that we use words in non-dictionary ways to mean whatever we need them to mean when we are trying to express what comes from the body mind whole self, when we focus.
Yeah. So we use words, not necessarily in a literal dictionary meaning, to express what we need to express.
That's exactly right. And in one sense, you could say that's always been true, because the dictionary word is just capturing what most people have most recently meant with a word, not a meaning that somehow exists like a table, if a table exists, and is a fixed thing. That's simply true of how language works. In addition, there are all the structures or uses of language that we can call metaphor, simile, analogy, and then the uses of those things in poetry. You and I were talking the last time we were together about how in certain contexts we give ourselves more permission to use words more fluidly. Mm-hmm. And I made that point about poetry. So that elasticity in language exists and can be talked about without reference to focusing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm hearing that sense of there's one broad area in which we say that words exist to directly point to some things that exist, like a table. And of course, that's presupposing that things do exist independently and words also exist. And there's that one-to-one correspondence between the word and the object. And then there's that other form of language in which language itself creates a reality. And that's in poetic language, where the use of words creates a certain mood, a certain, communicates a certain world and a certain experience.
Yes. Excuse me. And I would say that what you've just said about poetry is true in all uses of language. It's just that we are, I think, less likely to be surprised when a word in a poem doesn't point so directly to what it says in the dictionary than we are in prose or everyday conversation, because our expectations for the genre are more are broader, let's say. There's a few sort of crevasses on this great big glacier that I think are dangerous. And I'm not even counting the absolutely quotidian, daily, normal difficulties that we all encounter when what I mean when I say something is not what you understand when you hear it. That's just so normal. We live with that every day. It needs to be addressed, but I don't think of it as a special problem. The other special problems that I'm trying to put my finger on now come from, in most simply, really imprecise language, and then influential, like deliberately influential language that brings with it implications that are meant to have an impact. This is very gray because this is true also of everyday speech. The example that I always give is, was our military intervention in Iraq a liberation or an invasion? How you hear that story is going to depend very much on which word you choose and which word you hear when other people choose it.
So it's a framing. We're talking about a framing.
Yeah.
That as we choose words or use words by default, there is some degree of framing of the situation through which we see it.
Right. I was raised to value precision in language, not to be pedantic about it, but to care about subtext and to care about inference and to pick wisely, if possible, so as to take responsibility for what I was saying. And when I look back over my lifetime, I can think of moments where I had a real flash of horror or outrage because of not sloppy use of language, but sloppy use of language that then had a social impact. I'm remembering an acquaintance. We were in graduate school and everybody was leaving their offices open, and somebody's wallet was stolen. And the woman whose wallet was stolen wanted to point, understandably, to the idea that not only was she missing her wallet, but she felt that her space had been invaded, and that's an additional and very powerful part of her experience, with which I sympathized. But she said, "It's like I was raped," and I was outraged. I said, no, it's not. That undermines our empathy for the people who really have been. And that's the kind of framing that I react to, because it has a ripple effect on how we care for each other as human beings. I, of course, I failed in that moment to take good care of her, because a better use of language by me in that moment would be to say, I hear you choosing words to point to a sense of having been invaded, you know, that needed to be honored and respected by me. And I only reacted to what I saw as hyperbole. And I was actually reacting to what I considered to be the danger of that hyperbole.
That's a very beautiful example. The situation there is a situation where there is intense emotion. We're not talking about using words to describe, this is blue versus this is red. But this is something that's really deeply affecting both participants. The woman whose wallet was taken, but your reaction to her, and then your reaction to your reaction. And so we're talking about language in a relational context, and relating to how we relate to each other.
Beautifully put, and thank you for pointing that out, because this is where it gets. I would say this is why it matters. This is where it gets significant and important. And this helps me articulate why I worry about the aspects of this topic that relate to focusing. To put it crudely, really, the only word, I think a lot of people don't understand what Eugene Gendlin meant about a felt sense. And I think the phrase, I have heard it give rise to expressions like, well, my felt sense tells me I should go to this movie and not that movie, or that we should, or that you should, or that the right thing is. And it scares me because it's awfully close to, if a head of state says, the voice of God told me we should go to war, or I use the phrase voices, voices within us, and I'm scared by the difference. I do not want to be somebody who says, well, the voices in my head tell me it's a good idea to shoot you, or the voices in my head tell, the phrase voices in my head or voices in my body can point either towards something subtle and deep and worthy of time and respect and interested curiosity, or the very same phrase can point to madness, impulsiveness, thoughtlessness, crazy talk.
Yeah.
And
so I want to point something out, that actually you're using different words in both cases, and this is a conversation where we started talking about language and about how language frames something. In one instance, you're saying something about people who say, my felt sense tells me to. So you equate it with God tells me to. And so there's only one authority that presents one and only one path. But then the other situation that you describe is you say, I hear voices. Okay, that's and so the simple difference between one voice, whether it's the voice of the felt sense or the voice of God, that is the one and only direction, but the awareness that there can be many voices is a totally different situation. Even if you hear only one voice, but you're aware that there are several voices, then it becomes something where, our executive capacity is about sorting out which of the voices to hear, and hearing the voices as informants, and things to be questioned as opposed to just followed blindly.
What a brilliance, pointing to the singular versus the plural. That's very powerful. Yeah. Let's. I want to really absorb that. While that gestates for me, I want to point to the other sort of danger point. I think it's simultaneously incredibly powerful to recognize that words only mean what we mean them to mean when we say them.
Yeah.
And it's scary to me when we as a culture allow an extrapolation from that to the world of alternative facts, and there is no truth.
So you started with something that says word only mean what we mean them to mean,
right?
And make a difference between that and alternate facts and complete. So do you want to say a little bit more about words only mean what we mean them to mean?
Well, after reading a few books, Deborah Tannen's work in particular about sociolinguistics and how language impacts how we attempt to communicate with each other. My shorthand, and honestly, I can't remember whether Deborah Tannen said this in so many words or whether it's mine. If it's hers, I want to give proper due to her. My takeaway is that when you say something to me, I don't necessarily hear what you meant. I hear what I would have meant if I had said that. And really living with that knowledge has changed, and I would say very much enhanced my life, because it has led me to be much quicker to check whether what I think I have just heard is what you meant for me to hear.
So it's a little bit we're talking about the opposite of words only mean what we intend them to mean. Words only mean what the recipient means them to mean.
In a relational context, that is one of the hurdles, let's say, to real connection. In fact, there's a line, I think I quoted this to you before, I've seen it attributed to George Bernard Shaw, but then that was debunked. So I don't know if we know whoever said this, that the chief problem with communication is the belief that it has taken place. You say something, I get something, I go off happily and take action or come to a conclusion or make a judgment or have a belief based on what I think you said. And the first domino to fall in a sequence that can get us pretty far from where we mean to be is my assumption that I have heard you correctly.
Yeah, yeah. And so maybe that's a moment to put focusing in context, and to say that what we do with focusing is actually very much paying attention to that. When we listen to somebody, we don't assume that because they use words that mean something to us, we're necessarily understanding what they mean. And so there is kind of trial and error to see if what we understand is what they mean, if we hear is what they mean. But also when we are in the process of focusing, that we don't stop at the immediate meaning of a word, but we keep asking ourselves, let's go a little deeper. Let's not just end there. Having a word does not mean we capture the meaning we have, but we go a little bit deeper to see what else there might be.
Yes, and that's one of the things that's so enriching and brilliant about it as a process. There's something else that you're bringing to mind, which is that in a focusing partnership, if I am the focuser and you are my companion, you may not have the faintest clue what I meant by something that I just said, but you don't even need to. And in reflecting it back to me as my companion, at least in the several of the modes of or styles of focusing that I've practiced, you are mirroring to me what I have just said so that I can check whether that hits the spot for me. And furthermore, it may not even be words. It may be a sound, or it may be a gesture, or it may be a movement. And you don't have to get it at all. So much so that people can focus in language. You could be speaking Chinese and I could be speaking English and we can focus because I don't need to get it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
we're making here the difference between focusing in a pure way, and that can be used in either in therapy or peer-to-peer, from, say, a focusing conversation where it's more of an exchange and we are trying to understand each other, but we use focusing as a tool for inner clarification and clarification between us of what we mean. So there, where the intent is actually to know what it is that we're talking about.
Right. And that points, what you just said, points to another key sort of fork in the road in communication. When there's a conversation between two people, do they really want to understand each other?
Mm-hmm.
In a focusing communication that's identified as such, you have a better chance that both parties have consciously committed to wanting to understand each other. And they probably have reason to trust that there will be time to be heard as well as to hear. I think in everyday communication, you get into the most trouble when you have two people communicating with each other, both of whom desperately want to be heard. Because somebody has to put aside their desire to be heard in order to hear, to break the gridlock that happens between two people who are so longing to be heard that neither one of them is available to do any hearing. So these are the factors that go into let's call it successful communication, in which case we have to define what we mean by success, which in my book means that both people have heard and are heard.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Which is frankly rare. And I think one of the pitfalls is that we fall into when there's conflict or partisanship or too much unmet need is sort of the demand. It doesn't matter what you think, you should just do what I say, or, well, it doesn't matter that I just said that my computer is not resting on a table, but it's resting on the back of a whale, because what I mean by whale is, round and made of wood.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. But that's really nice. I think what you're pointing out is that there are so many different layers in communication, and there are so many layers to being a human being. And when we're in conversation, we tend to oversimplify and have a model of conversation where what's happening is content is exchanged. And we're reasoning as if we're two computers sending each other content and analyzing or responding to content. But just what you're describing is that there are many layers, and so we cannot deal with conversation when we just think of one layer.
Right.
And the more we're able to go onto the many layers, the emotional content, for instance, a sense of I need to be heard and you need to be heard, and we have not addressed the sense of safety and trust that
right.
makes us, alternate.
Right.
We have, possible confusion as to what we mean, possible inner confusion, all of these many different layers.
Right. Yes, you're pointing to, I'm just going to pick up one stitch of what you said, which is that in conversation and in focusing, as the conversation proceeds, if we're lucky, we have the opportunity to get clearer ourselves, within ourselves. Never mind the question of what gets communicated to the other person. Very often, it takes a bunch of passes to get clear, even about a perfectly ordinary content exchange. There's so many possibilities for misunderstanding. And then when it finally gets clear, the recipient can easily say, well, why didn't you say that before? And one possible answer is, I did, but we didn't get it. And the other another of many possibilities is, I didn't know I was saying that until just now.
Yeah.
Never mind the infinite possibilities for misunderstanding. I read an article in the Times just yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, the longest ago, about trouble on the campus at the University of Wisconsin, racial tension. And somebody put up a sign, I'm not going to quote this correctly, there's another problem with communication, but it was something to the effect of, Black students aren't welcome at the University of Wisconsin. And the initial reaction by the administration and by the people who read it was, what an unspeakably, horribly racist thing to post. We need to find the white racist or the non-Black racist who posted this. And then it turned out that it was an African-American student complaining that this appears to be the case rather than advocating that this should be the case. right?
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
gorgeous example.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it should be that,
Mm-hmm.
quote, versus this appears to be the case and it's wrong.
Yeah. The sad truth is, yeah.
That truth is opposite, absolutely opposite.
Yeah.
Classic example.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. But so what we're talking about here is in a conversation, in a dialogue of two people, as opposed to, of course, the complex layers that might magnified when we're talking about a whole social thing as a whole university,
right.
In a dialogue of two people where there's already a lot of layers, and we're talking about the layers of language, but also the emotional layers, the inner, the interpersonal, that a lot of the conversation itself is about paying attention to the sense of am I clear in myself about what I'm saying? Am I clear in myself about what I'm hearing? And are we clear between each other about that? And not with a sense that, I have to make it clear,
right?
Just that rigidity,
Right.
but with some kind of a delight in the idea that the lack of clarity is part of the process.
Delight.
Embracing, not necessarily delight, but, kind of
at least acknowledge
acceptance of it. Sometimes delight,
right?
But at least, when it's frustrating,
right?
The sense that it's impossible not to.
Right. There is actually a delight. I'm glad you said that. The delight for me comes from there is delight in hope, and the hope that I'm referring to now comes from the realization that with an acknowledgement of layers, with an openness to checking, do you mean this? Do you mean that? Do I mean this? Do I mean, what am I? Does it need a gesture? All those things. That's where hope for conflict resolution lies. That's where hope for connection lies. I know that when I was younger and I first began to appreciate just how many things can go, quote unquote, wrong in a communication, I was troubled. I thought, oh my God, what are the odds, that this is ever going to go right? But moving through that into a realization that in that case, all you need to do really is check. All you need to do is be curious. All you need to do is be interested. All you need to do is question or be open or wait or sense into. That opened up and opens up the path towards really connecting and really understanding each other.
Yeah. So what it brings up for me is the image of people who are mountain climbing, and they have to have three, the two hands and 2 feet, and of the 4, 3 have to be solidly attached someplace.
Oh.
4th moves. You cannot move, certainly all 4. You cannot move, the 2 hands at the same time. But if you have 3 of them gripping, then the other one can move, and little by little, you move. So that sense of establishing safety in the process of moving ahead.
That's very interesting. I think I would something in me wants to push back on the idea of safety. You certainly, the curiosity and awareness and the pause that I was referring to before help make things safer. But to be open and curious and interested may require bravery.
Mm-hmm.
And bravery is about recognizing that it isn't safe and doing it anyway and taking care of oneself. Responding to the threats, that come, and breathing through them, and maybe even taking a leap,
Mm-hmm.
with maybe even detaching the three other extremities, the hands and feet, from the, not on a sheer cliff face, but to leap across something.
Mm-hmm.
And the something that needs to be leapt across is very likely our own sense of some aspect of our own sense of danger, that it has to be okay, not to ignore it, but to take the risk of being present.
Yeah. But so this is a good moment. I want to stay there a little bit, because one thing that happens is the point you're making. That what happened is I used the word safety in an example that was focused on safety.
Mm-hmm.
And you went to say, yeah, but, and so it led you to say, there's something else that's actually important to me that the focus on safety does not, capture. And you went to that notion of, at times, really how important it is to not prioritize safety, but to do the leap. Doesn't mean being crazy, but just, and so there was a moment where you went into your experience of it, and, you reacted, responded to the word safety in order to find something that was there. But as I'm listening to you, I'm noticing there is, for me, a dialogue internally when you say, kind of sometimes you have to be bold, or it's not the same thing. I'm thinking, yeah, but it can be done within the context of safety that's not mutually exclusive. And so here I am. And so we could easily, at this moment, be arguing. And I could make the point of, no, really, this is important, and this is contained within my concept of safety, and so on and so forth. But it's really actually very wonderful to notice there is some overlap and there is some expansion, as you introduce that. And it's not an either or, but that really essentially there's an enrichment that just happened. But to notice also the inner tendency to kind of, I'm noticing a sense of wanting to hang on for a moment but my concept, it was okay. And then a sense of, okay, once I've done that and I've gotten to notice that tendency to attach to it, kind of, okay, it's easier to let it go and to follow you where you're going.
Yes, and what's beautiful about that is the possibility of sort of coming together on the other side of the two originating points. Because in fact, where I was going to go next, I could feel myself going there, merges beautifully with what you're talking about, which is, I said, if you boldly take a step that has a risk, but you are confident you can handle that risk, then the notion of safety is big enough to encompass that taking a risk you can handle is also a safe move.
Yeah. Right?
So the safety is big enough,
have expanded the notion of safety.
That's right. That's right. Actual people who really climb cliff faces are talking about safety all the time while they're doing something that I would be too scared to start.
Right. Right. And so that may be the biggest point, is that actually in that, that's expanding that concept of safety as opposed to narrowing
right.
the field of possible.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
A beautiful example. This is an instance of exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah. So I'm going to just kind of circle back a bit to see, where we started from. Whether we got to something which is where you wanted to go with to some degree, or whether something is missing in that.
Mm. For me, there may be, I want to make sure that I want to be clear that while our emphasis has been on, I think, on giving me the opportunity to express what I've been thinking about since our last conversation, I want to make sure that it's still truly a conversation, not only as we return to this question, what was I on about at the beginning? I want to make sure that I say as clearly as I can that my reason for wanting to express what I was on about at the beginning of the conversation was to invite a next step together and from you.
Yeah. So actually, my experience of this was very participatory. I started with the intention that this was going to be focused on you, because you had a clear idea of where you wanted to start and to express it. What I found in the process of actually listening to where you went and following you there is that it invited a sense of my own resonance, my own dialogue with it, and to not only did I actually intervene at times to put in my 2 cents worth, but actually the meaning of the conversation changed for me. And from something that was going to be just the part that you wanted to express, it turned into, for me, a discussion on what is a conversation that is done with that focusing attitude of paying attention to self, to other, to dialogue, to words, to meaning, to feelings, and actually kind of a discussion of that as well.
Right. And
I did not, when it dawned on me that we were doing this, I didn't come in with a red flag and say, hey, the meaning for me has changed a little bit. But then I felt that how we were talking was very much going in that direction. And so I felt very, very, very creatively involved in what happened.
That's just wonderful. And it's reminding me of a conversation that I had with Eugene Gendlin himself. It was on one of the arrangements that Anne Weiser Cornell had made, where Gene made himself available and people could call in with a question and actually converse with him. And I asked him a question that he struggled with, and he didn't like how I had framed the question, and it activated in him a concern about exactly what we're talking about he perceived me as wanting to make words rigid and find definitions for things. And then we worked it out. And I was trying to actually ask him a little more about what he meant, what made for him the difference between focusing and some other activity. When is one focusing? And in the end, we arrived at a conversation together that was as fluid, and in which we were each present and curious and open with the other in the way that you and I have been. And he said, that's what I mean by focusing. What we're doing right now is what I mean by focusing. It's quite lovely.
Yeah, yeah.